Hi, good morning, everyone. This session is about data governance, and we have our partner Skyflow to also help you understand what data governance is all about. There's also Bhaskar and Sean who would be taking over the respective discussions that we will have around data governance. And starting with that, I'd like to talk a little bit about Tsaaro and what we do as a company. So, Tsaaro, of course, if you have been a part of our previous webinars, we are a data protection consulting firm primarily operating out of India and Europe. And we help organizations improve their security and privacy compliance postures. And that's how we are also conducting this webinar to increase and create that awareness around data governance and how Skyflow can actually help you assist with data governance in your organizations. Sean, I would just hand it over to you for the next few minutes as well. If you can quickly introduce Skyflow and, of course, also introduce yourself.
Hi there. Hi, everyone. My name is Sean Faulkner, and I'm head of marketing and developer relations at Skyflow. And Skyflow was founded to solve a very big problem, essentially, which is that there's data breaches that happen on a regular basis with companies all over the world. There's a very big one happening in the United States right now with T-Mobile, actually, one of the big carriers here. And it's very hard for companies to essentially protect their data as well as comply with the rules and regulations around the world. And essentially, Skyflow offers a platform that you can essentially offload a lot of the challenges around compliance, data security, and data privacy to this platform through a simple set of APIs. So we'll be digging into some of the details of that later.
Sure. Thank you, Sean. Bhaskar, I would just hand it over to you again. Bhaskar is our privacy subject matter expert. So Bhaskar, if you could also introduce yourself to the attendees here.
Sure. Thanks, Krishan. I'm Bhaskar. I'm working at the Data Privacy Council, and I've been in this data privacy compliance domain for the last 6 years, mostly with the consulting industry. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Bhaskar, and thank you, Sean, for that introduction. A quick introduction about myself as well and what my role here is at Tsaaro. So I'm the director for security as well as privacy compliances for our clients here at Tsaaro. And a few of the certifications around security and privacy are also something that you would see on the screen. But moving over to the crux of the discussion for today, data governance, right? So when we look at data governance, we will cover what data governance is. We will also cover a few aspects of it and the top tips that you have to keep in mind. But at the same time, having said that, just a short disclaimer to everyone that whatever views are presented here are solely our own, Bhaskar, Sean, and my personal views on data governance as well as related subjects. And of course, this is something that we are discussing just to create that awareness around in the industry. So the agenda is around data governance. We will look at the purposes of data governance. We will also try and understand why do businesses actually need it and what is the need for data governance to be pushed from the top management within an organization. What is the process a standard data governance program follows? And since we do these trainings or these webinars on Menti, so we also expect our participants to pitch in with their responses as and when the questions pop in. And similarly, we will also cover the tokenization aid for data governance. And of course, towards the end, Sean would take us over a few slides where he would also be able to explain how Skyflow functions as a tool or a solution that can help you with the whole crux of data governance. So Bhaskar, I would just hand this over to you. If you can quickly go through the different nuances of data governance and what does it mean, and probably explain those 4 phases that we have here.
Okay. Thanks, Krishan. So data governance is having, like for an organization, data governance is having a framework in place which will help you define your policies, which will help define the standards and metrics for your people, and which will define the rules that you enforce for secure data usage on your technology. So I think having that detailed strategy in place to govern all these 3, people, process, and technology in the organization, for efficient use of the information available that you can rely upon. That's a total yardstick of data governance in an organization.
Right. So, Bhaskar, what do you think are some tips startups can also look into? For example, the newer startups that are coming up in India or maybe globally or especially in the Europe, right? What do you think are some of the tips they can take care of when they start with the data governance process?
I think to start, one of the most important thing is to define the goals of the organization. When your project objectives are very clear, you can start with the data governance or data classification strategy. Have someone accountable for that entire data movement in your organization to manage that data. There should be an administration over that data, and you should have a case study on the basis of which you will define the rules for data usage, the metrics and the standards. So these are some of the tips to start. It should be very small, and you should look at the base level while going up for the data governance strategy for the organization.
Right. And Bhaskar, I think there's a common misconception when we talk to senior folks in the industry about data privacy, because a lot of those people correlated directly to data governance. So can you shed some light on the differences between data governance and data privacy, and they relate exactly?
Yeah, so data governance is actually a much wider term here. Data privacy, while privacy is concerned about the protection of personal information, data governance is about the entire usage of your data, which is there in your organized environment. So it will help you. It will help you in digital transformation. It will help you in making the right decisions when you have correct data analysis in place. So data privacy is, you can call it a subset, or it's a part of compliance of the entire personal data in your organization, while data governance is for all kinds of data that is there in your organization.
Right. Right. Sean, at any time, if you feel you have a few points to add, feel free to unmute and just add up those points. And yeah, I think see, if you look at data governance from an overall perspective, it is something organizations look for when they are at a higher maturity level. But do you feel organizations should ideally start with data governance as and when they begin their data collection journey?
Yeah, data collection itself should start on a data governance strategy. I think data governance is the first step for any organization. You should have a clear catalog and categorization scheme in place, based on which you will collect the data, and you will start the cataloging of data at the initial level itself.
Right. So I think there's also a Q&A, which is based on one of the previous questions we've just answered. This is about how can startup companies approach data governance? Right. So Venkat, we just answered this question, but Bhaskar, would you like to summarize it again? Just a quick summary of how can startups approach data governance, please?
Yeah, you can start. Startups can. The best way to go about it will be have a data governance strategy, which will include data cataloging, data ownership, define the data ownership, define data security in your organization, define the access management of that particular data, define the data lifecycle management, how it will go through from collection till usage till disposal, secure disposal of that data. Have processes in place to ensure data quality, because you need to rely on a single source of truth. All the decision makers, you need to ensure that all decision makers are relying on that single source of truth. So I think all these practices and ensuring ethical use of data, that's a key point here.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think one of the challenges that companies have when they don't essentially start to tackle this problem early is that they get to a point where they built a large system that's run or has lots of users, a tremendous amount of data, and then sort of trying to unravel all that complexity at that stage is a really, really hard, intractable problem. And that's when it comes to intermixing some sensitive data, regulated data. That's where things like compliance, data security, data privacy become really, really hard problems to solve, because you just essentially have data everywhere and you don't even know where it is.
That's right. I think also looking at the kind of services that are coming up these days around finding that lost data or recovering those unknown assets in your IT infrastructure, right? So that could also probably help you understand what happens when you don't have that kind of mapping planned out since the very beginning. You have a bunch of different unknown assets that contains a lot of confidential information, maybe about your business or maybe about people, personal information about people, right? So that kind of activities or those shadow IT infra can be avoided if you have a mapping from the very beginning of data collection activities. So let me just, So Bhaskar, there are 5 functions that we have defined here that focuses a bit about the purposes of data governance. So it's difficult for an organizational information security or a data privacy team to communicate with their senior leadership on why is data governance required. So what do you think are the key pointers they can also include in their business use case while they pitch it to their senior management?
Yeah, I think we have rightly highlighted here the key pointers. Unless we have data governance in place, there is no reliability on that data. The usability of data is left redundant if you can't rely on that data. So ensuring that you're using right kind of data will help the organization move forward in an efficient manner. That's the key point here. It improves your business case, and also if it's a large enterprise which is and where people are located all over the place and they are using this data, you need to ensure that you have a common database and all the decision makers are using the same set of data from a single source of truth. So at the end of the day, when you're making a business decision, you need to have the right kind of data in front of you. For that purpose, data governance is the most important foundation. It's like a bedrock. So that's what I would say. For pitching into the management, you need to highlight what is the usage of that data and why are you collecting that data. What are the purposes of data processing there in your organization? If there's a defined purpose, obviously, then you need it for your business growth. So that's a key point.
Right. So Sean, in your experience, I believe you would have been asked this question: why should I have a data governance framework, right? What would be your opinion on this? On, what are some of the business use cases that you can highlight to senior management?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of it is around making sure that you're controlling access to data. So, especially I'm always thinking about this from essentially the sensitive type of data you're storing. So, like personal information about your customers and so on. You don't want your entire company or everybody that works internally to have access to that information. So you need to control access. So how are you going to do that? Well, then you're naturally starting to talk about data governance. If you don't essentially tackle that problem early, it's the same thing as taking on like tech debt when you talk about like coding principles and stuff like that. Cutting those corners is eventually going to catch up with you in a big way, where you're going to have a much harder problem to solve, and something that's going to cost you a lot more money to actually solve, and also slow down essentially the development of your business. So it's just fundamentally, besides good engineering and good privacy practice, good business sense to essentially start to tackle this problem early and get a hold of it.
Sure. I think what organizations can also understand is that whenever you start a new buzzword in the industry, right? Because for senior management, people who are not aware with this term, maybe it would be another buzzword like privacy is for most senior management today, right? But then again, if you support it with the business case on how can data governance effectively enhance the maturity of the organization, that would definitely help you push it forward within your organizations too. Right. So I believe regulatory, legal, and industry compliance is a benefit that people see for data governance. And there's also cost reduction and better, more reliable data that we have as options. But Sean, I would like you to take over the part where we have included cost reduction. How do you think having an effective data governance program would reduce the costs incurred to the company?
So I think there's a couple things. One, which I already spoke about, which is that if you don't have essentially governance in place, early in a business, then essentially you're going to get to a point where it's a really, really hairy problem to try to solve. So it's going to cost you more, essentially resources in terms of paying people within your company to deal with that problem, and then also tooling and tracking down where all these issues are. But also related to regulatory, legal, and industry compliance, if you don't have those controls in place, then besides violating some compliance regulations, you might also be fined because you're essentially violating those things too. So in a sense, like you're avoiding a fine, and that is a potential cost reduction to your business as well.
Right. Bhaskar, would you like to add anything to that on how we can reduce the cost using a data governance program?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges or the cost which the company can be faced with, that's a compliance cost. compliance costs or the fines that may be imposed. If you have a clear data management and governance strategy in place, as a privacy professional, I have seen this. It benefits the professionals a lot while responding to data subject requests or while complying with any other data subject request which requires you to erase some data, which requires you to provide access to some data. So in all those cases, or while reporting the data incident breaches, breach incidents. So if your organization has clear policies, everyone knows their roles clearly. This helps a lot in meeting the compliance requirements, and that can help reduce costs by a lot. Yeah.
Right. So I think cost reduction, of course, is there, but having all those options out there, all of you must have also realized that all of the above was probably the right option, right? All of these options are something data governance would help you achieve. But why do businesses need data governance? It helps you set that enterprise level push for managing data more effectively. For example, we talk a lot about data lifecycle management. And data governance inherently does data lifecycle management, but at the same time gives you more control over the data that you hold as a company, right? And some simpler costs that you might be able to save is by making sure you have that data governance program in place. You would also delete unnecessary data, right? Because most organizations today have databases that have been there for the last 20 years, but they are not aware of it, or they're not ready to delete it because they're not sure what would happen, right? So this is what lack of data governance program could also cause. And now looking at some of the other questions that's in the Q&A. So Deepak has a question around why do you think these data breaches continue to happen? Presuming organizations might have some data governance in place may not be the best. Right. So Sean, would you like to take it up?
Sure. So I think there's a couple reasons here. It's like data governance is not a holistic solution to all like data privacy and data security issues. Just because you have some layer of control over who and what can be seen. One, like not all data governance frameworks are going to be created equal. It depends really on how what policies are in place. You could create a policy that essentially says that like everybody has access to everything. You have data governance, you've done some sort of tooling there, but you've essentially given way too much access. So mistakes like that happen. And then additionally, even if you're controlling access, if someone essentially socially engineers someone into getting their credentials and then has access to the information, potentially how protected is that data? Is it stored encrypted? What's the encryption key policy? So you need to be thinking about how you're actually protecting the information as well. And then the other thing, one of the big challenges though, especially with large systems, is that the data is going to exist most likely in a lot of different locations. So it might be in your application database, it might be in like a data warehouse, a data lake. And even if you're applying governance to each of those locations, well, then there's the backup systems, there's the log files. Data essentially is kind of sensitive data that gets passed through these downstream services, essentially ends up in like all the nodes and edges of these different systems that we have. And you got to be thinking about how you're protecting each of those locations. So even if you're using sort of, built-in governance to something like a Snowflake data warehouse, well, what's your plan for protecting essentially your log files? So all this stuff starts to really add up to the complexity of just like managing this holistically between how you're managing, encryption keys, protecting the data, as well as essentially the proliferation of the data, and then holistically governing access. So there's a lot of components that go into this beyond just essentially controlling who and what can be seen.
Right. Sean, on adding on to that point, I just wanted to ask you, what are your tips on making sure that there's a relevant metric that we can track, and also something that you can show to the management for an ROI on the data governance program? This is a question by one of the attendees.
So the question is what's the, how do you think about ROI? So yeah. So I think that there's a couple of ways to think about this. One is you can, of course, look at the cost of a data breach. So if you're not doing anything to protect your data, you're putting yourself at significant risk. Just do a Google News search for data breach, and you're going to see lots and lots of examples of companies that have been compromised. So besides the cost of paying whatever fines you have to do, potential class action suit lawsuits that you have to deal with. You're also losing a ton of trust in essentially the customers that you've worked so hard to close. So you got to think about like that is a tremendous amount of potential revenue that you're losing, even beyond just the fines. So a lot of the ROI is around like protecting yourself. The other thing that I think we touched on a little bit earlier is there's also, depending on the country, but one of the things that we're seeing in the United States anyway is that there's a cultural shift that's happening with both consumers as well as companies. So companies, because I think of consumer demand and consumer awareness of all of these, essentially the abuse of their data by companies, is that newer stage companies are starting to use privacy as a differentiator as well. So there's also essentially this shift that's happening where I think newer companies, as well as some older companies like Apple that's always been big on privacy, are using privacy essentially as like a marketing tool and a differentiator. So then if that's the shift that's happening in the world and you're not part of that, you're going to be left essentially amongst the old guard of companies that no one really wants to give their data to or be part of, because why would you want to do that when you actually care about making sure that there's no abuse of your data actually going on?
Yep, I think that's a fairly good point, Sean, about the data privacy aspect being used as the marketing tool. But also looking at some of the ROIs, I believe you also mentioned reputational damage or that trust issue that you lose with your organization. So that's unfortunately not a very quantifiable metric, but at the same time, it's the most impactful. If you lose that reputation, if you lose that trust with your existing customer base, then there's no guarantee that you can bounce back from it, right? So that, yeah, Bhaskar, if you want to add something here.
Definitely, I agree with that.
Sure.
I agree with that point, Krishna. Yeah, it's used as a trust mark now in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, you think about like the early days of like TLS or SSL. It wasn't that the entire web was HTTPS. It used to be mostly HTTP, but then people would put these little, trust certifications on their login pages and stuff that it was going to switch into SSL. And then now, like the entire world essentially operates. It's hard to find a website that's essentially not sending data encrypted over TLS now. And that's just the shift that happened. And if you suddenly launched a new company today that was running on HTTP, everybody would be like, what is going on here? Like, why would I ever, essentially sign up for your service? It feels untrustworthy. But a bigger shift now is happening, I think, where companies that don't prioritize these are going to be left essentially behind. They're going to be part of the old guard, and it's going to look strange if they don't have strong security and privacy posture.
Right. I think good that you also mentioned that example about the padlock icon that also came up with HTTPS, correct? Because having said that, I've also discussed this with a few of folks who are not into IT security or privacy. And the marketing people or organizations have done around it is so incredible that people feel that having a padlock sign is all they need. And now they are trusting that website and the website is completely secure. That's the kind of push that has been made around it. So it's fascinating to see how they use that as a great marketing tool, and also in advertisements that they have nothing to worry about. The payments are secure because they are encrypted, even if they're using, vulnerable versions of TLS. Right. So that's one of the things that I've also noticed. Looking at data governance use cases, Bhaskar, would you like to take this up and talk a bit about some privacy compliance?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is a good example here where an organization struggled to identify all the personal information that was being processed in the organization in its various systems. Then, with the help of data governance tool, they were able to find, classify, and secure sensitive data of its users. I think similar things I have also seen at my client's place when I was working with clients for data privacy compliance, where they started with data categorization or data classification strategy first, and then they identified the different types of data. Based on that, they were able to identify the types of risks associated with that data, because something was personal, something was more sensitive or sensitive personal information. So clients were able to identify that, categorize it, and based on it, they did a risk assessment, categorizing each vendor on base of risk matrix and defining the mitigation strategy. So yeah, I've also seen the similar situation when it came to data governance and privacy compliance.
Right. I think one of the other factors in privacy compliance, the issue about it is because we have no visibility, right? We don't know the kind of data the organization collects and where do they store them. Even if the security and IT controls are in place to protect that data from being sent outside, but at the same time, we don't know what's inside, right? And that causes a big issue within organizations on how can they push data privacy. And looking at some stats, you would see that Gartner expects that by 2024, around 75% of the global population will be covered by some sort of privacy regulation. It may not be as comprehensive as the GDPR, but there would be some that comes in to protect those rights and make sure that organizations have increased obligations around it. Right. So these things are definitely happening around, and I would just go on to Menti again so that I can quickly check if the attendees are still here. Right. So please go to this link that you would see on the chat section. My team would, if you can, quickly share your opinion on the goal that an organization can achieve by integrating data governance into their processes. I mean, it could be one goal, it could be a list of different goals, but what is that goal that comes to your mind that data governance will help you achieve? Right. Waiting for some keywords here so that we can also take it up in our next few minutes of conversation. Those are some pretty good keywords for us to build this conversation. And yeah, data protection, trust, integrity, data privacy, compliance are some of the keywords that we've identified. So Bhaskar, I would just hand it over to you if you can explain the data governance process on. We've discussed this a little in the previous few slides, but just a very high level overview of the data governance process.
Yeah, sure. So I think before we touch upon this process, as you said, Krishna, in the last point, organization needs to know its data. It needs to have the visibility. I would say organizations which are familiar with the data that they're using have a higher chance of defining a data monetization policy if they want at all, at the internal level or external level. So clearly, data governance is important for that. And the stepwise execution of that would be starting with the documentation of having defined and documented strategies and processes in place to govern and to manage the entire data. Then having the frameworks in place to implement that security part for increasing the efficient use of your data, for securing the data and reducing the chances of any incidents which may take place. Unauthorized access being the most common data breach incident which happens across the organizations on a global scale. Here, automation may also assist you if you can fast forward on some collection strategies, collection mechanisms, or you can have different kinds of collection platforms or privacy compliant pop-ups on those platforms. Then have privacy by design, or if not privacy by design, have functionalities built in your systems, built in your technology, so that you can ensure compliance at every step. These are some key steps for ensuring data governance process in an organization.
Right. I think this is a really good approach on how we can create that process and what would be the key activities or the kind of checklist that you would carry around to initiate and implement that process as well. Right. So focusing on the documentation is, of course, the first part in any data governance or data related activity. You need to know what you're doing and you need that support from the management. So better to have that organizational policy pushed from your senior leadership so that it's easier for you to also get your work done and probably have more teams discuss with you on the kind of data they collect. Definitely not all organizations start with a data discovery tool, but then again, manual data discovery is something they would have to do to initiate this process. Sean, is there anything you would want to add on the data governance process part?
No, I don't have anything to add. I think Bhaskar did a great job covering that.
Sure. Right. So let's talk a bit about tokenization and how can tokenization aid data governance. Right. There's compliance, there's safeguarding integrity. This is also something we had in one of the questions where people put up integrity, trust as being the crucial values that are the benefits of data governance. Then tokenization also makes sure that there is a secure usage and security of data. So Sean, I would hand it over to you if you can explain our attendees what is tokenization and how can it be related with these four critical pillars that we've put up here.
Yeah, so tokenization is essentially a privacy preserving technique that substitutes sensitive data for what is called a non-sensitive token. So you can think of the token essentially as like a random string or like a pointer that can be a stand-in for the original value. So if you essentially move your sensitive data into a token vault and exchange it with the token and then store the tokens in your database, even if someone stole your database, then essentially all they have access to is a bunch of random strings. So they don't have a way to essentially reverse the token back to the original value unless they have the authority to do that. And you get the authority to do that through essentially how the data is governed, or you can control access to the token vault or wherever you're storing that. In the Skyflow world, that's the data privacy vault, which I'll talk about in a bit. But essentially, you need to combine these two things together, because tokenization is a great tool for compliance, for descoping your systems from seeing any of the sensitive data. But then you need to also make sure that not just anybody can essentially exchange the token for the original value. Because if they can exchange the token for the original value, then you've kind of defeated the purpose of using tokenization in the first place.
Right. So, of course, tokenization is something that organizations can definitely look into if they are trying to implement data governance, because looking at compliance and safeguarding data or security of data as well, right? It is an additional layer that you can put up to make sure that data governance programs are pushed technologically as well, right? It's not just a documentation thing that you have to do, but at the same time, you have to implement it at an organizational level, right? So tokenization is something organizations can look forward to. Yeah. So just this last question around tokenization solutions, and then I would hand it over to Sean to give us a walkthrough about Skyflow and what Skyflow does as an organization, a bit more brief about it. Before that, just the last question around tokenization solutions. So tokenization solutions today are built to comply with for protecting which kind of data, right? Just you can take an example on this one. We should have probably used explain these acronyms. But yeah, PAN is permanent account number. It's an account number that's okay, perfect, right? We already have responses. So I'm assuming people understand this, these different acronyms. There's also a question. Let's just take that up as well, right? So Anis has a question, which is that don't you think, in view of the size of data generated each passing day, there may be kind of guidelines for the organizations, especially big ticket companies, from governments, to have a mandatory data governance policy within the organization? So, Bhaskar, would you like to take that one? Law is your specialty, yeah.
Yeah, I think given how entire information security laws or regulatory setup is in India right now, we have privacy laws in different places. Like, for example, if you talk about the banking sector, RBI has different circulars, different mandatory requirements. If you talk about the telecom sector, the telecom providers license will have different terms and conditions, which will have some of these requirements. So there's no mandatory law as such, or a codified book there which regulates data governance as of now in India. But yeah, definitely for large enterprises, especially for companies from critical industries, for example, energy sector or telecom sector. For all these players, there should be some code of conduct from regulatory bodies to have mandatory data governance practices in place. Definitely, yeah.
Perfect. So, thank you, Bhaskar. Now, Sean, I would like you to take the stage and give us a bit more information about Skyflow. Over to you.
Sure, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about essentially how to govern access to data using Skyflow. And what we're particularly care about is essentially what we would call sensitive data. And sensitive data can mean a variety of different things, but the way I always describe it is the type of data that essentially you're storing about your customers that you wouldn't want showing up on the front page of a newspaper. So there's regulated data, and then there's also potentially data that's not technically regulated, but is sensitive to your customers and sensitive to your business. Well, Skyflow can essentially help you protect that. So before we jump into like how Skyflow thinks about solving this problem, let's take a look at the challenge of dealing with governing access to sensitive data in essentially a system that's not using a solution like Skyflow. So I talked about this a little bit earlier, but when you have a modern system today, so this is a fairly simple example, but we have, an application front end, and we're going to collect data like someone's phone number, and essentially we are going to pass that through all these nodes and edges of graph. So that something like someone's phone number seems fairly innocent. We're collecting from, our account sign up page. We end up essentially with a copy of that data throughout these different systems. So that phone numbers, social security numbers, passport numbers, whatever kind of information we're collecting about our customers essentially ends up copied, fragmented, and replicated throughout the system. So we end up with this sensitive data sprawl problem. And the reason that is a problem is because now, instead of having a single copy of that data, we have thousands of copies of that data. So companies essentially, they just lose track of what and where they're storing it. If you don't know what you're storing or where it is, then that makes governing access to it really, really hard. And then it makes these other challenges like, are we sure we're compliant? Are we sure that the data is actually locked down, that's protected? Really, really hard to answer as well. It's like, instead of having a single copy of your passport in your, locked away in a safe place in your home, you have thousands of copies of your passport that you distribute all over the place, and then you try to protect them. Well, that's a much more difficult problem to solve than having one copy of your passport that you keep in a safe location in your house. But that's what we're doing with data. And that's really a big part of the fundamental problem, why so many companies struggle to both essentially control access to the information, but also continually struggle, even if they're applying some sort of layer of governance to this, continue to struggle with things like data breaches because the data ends up in all these different locations. So how do we solve this problem? Well, the approach that we essentially advise companies to take is that they should be using something called a data privacy vault. So data privacy vault is essentially a technology or architectural design pattern that was originally pioneered by companies like Apple and Netflix and Google and a handful of others, but it essentially isolates, secures, stores, and tightly controls access to manage and use sensitive data. So you can think of it like a specially designed technology just built for protecting and storing essentially sensitive data. So instead of storing that in your application database or your data warehouse and all these places where it ends up proliferating like we saw before, you're making the choice to essentially move that into a special location. So if we go back to the system we talked about before, where we end up with sensitive data sprawl, when we introduce the vault, what we're doing is essentially we're creating a single source of truth that's isolated and protected outside of our existing system for all the sensitive data. So whenever we're collecting data or sensitive customer data, we want to essentially de-identify it as early in the life cycle as possible by moving it into the data privacy vault. Here we're doing it from an application front end, but that could be a source into an ETL pipeline or wherever you're essentially sucking in data. So instead of the phone number now going through the system, what we're doing is we're generating a token. So we talked about tokenization. Here, this is essentially a random string. You can think of it like a pointer if you're an engineer. And this is like a reference back to the original data or stand-in. And now we're going to store the token in the database in the data warehouse. And when it comes to the log files, essentially the log files, whatever data we're storing there, we don't have to worry about essentially accidentally logging someone's home address into a log file that's unprotected and gets compromised later. Now we just have a token that's in there. So even if the log file gets compromised, it's just a random string. So by taking this essentially architectural design pattern approach to privacy, by moving the sensitive data into this secure location, we are de-risking this entire surface area of our application stack. So the big question, of course, now becomes, how do we control access to that? So just because we're swapping it for tokens, if anybody can essentially get that token, make an API call and exchange it for the original value, we haven't really done much other than at least we know where the data is now. So how do we control access? So if we have something like making an API call, give it a bunch of tokens, we want to de-tokenize that information back to the original value. If you're an engineer, you can think of this like essentially dereferencing the pointer. You want to exchange these tokens for the original values, but you want to make sure that the person who's calling this or the service is calling it actually has the rights to exchange that token for the original value. So how can we do that? So what we've done at Skyflow is we've developed something that we developed a policy-based access control model. So this builds on some of the best parts of RBAC or BBAC model or ABAC models, but adding in additional fine-grained control over the zero trust data privacy vault. So in our world, we have two types of entities essentially that can access information. It could be a user or it could be a service account. A service account is how you programmatically access data. And each of these can be assigned a role, and each role can essentially have a group of policies. And the policies are created through a simple language that we created, where you can control exactly what columns and rows and how that information is used. So here we have a simple example. We're allowing read on the name and the credit card, but we're saying that the name can be read in plain text, whereas the credit card can be read in as a mass value. So you can build up these simple rules. And essentially, any user or service account that doesn't have policies associated with it, it doesn't have access to any information because it's a zero trust model. So essentially, zero trust means you don't have access to anything until you explicitly give access. So it's a model where you're building up essentially the levels of access that you need for the specific business requirements of the service or the user. So we're going to take a look at a simple example here. So I'll hop over to a quick demo. So this demo is a demo that is built to demonstrate how data governance works in Skyflow. So you can see here the admin role here essentially has access to all this data in the vault. But say we have a marketing person. Well, a marketing person, they might need the name and the email address, but they don't need social security number of someone. They maybe need a month and the day of their birth so they can send them a birthday announcement each year, but they don't need to know how old they are. So essentially they see that information as masked, and then they have the state. And that's built through this simple policy language. We're allowing, read essentially on name and email and state in plain text, but date of birth is masked. And if we take someone like customer support, well, they need access to even less information. They have name, they have last four social, which is sometimes used for validation, entity validation in the United States, and they have state. But there's an additional level of restriction here where they only have access to the records that are in the state of Arizona. So there's a row level constraint here as well. So they have access to only a handful of records. So the big advantage here is that for situations where, when it comes to things like data breaches or, cyber attacks that happen, someone who's determined enough a lot of times can get access to something, but you can significantly reduce the damage of that by using a combination of the zero trust model and then essentially least privileged access based on these policies that you're creating. So if you look at something like the Robinhood data breach that happened a little over a year ago, there, a customer support agent essentially got socially engineered to giving up their credentials, and those things can happen. But that customer support agent had access to 6 million customer records. So why do they have access to 6 million customer records? And there's no reason for it. Essentially, someone who's a customer support agent needs probably only access to the records that are in their queue at any given time. So if you think about essentially access to information that way, even if something like the Robinhood data breach happened, now that attacker has access to maybe 10 records that are in the queue rather than 6 million records. So you can significantly reduce the impact of something like that. All right, so we'll jump back to the presentation here. I'll just go over a couple more things, a couple more use cases. So that's basic, essentially, data governance in Skyflow, being able to exchange tokens for the original values based on those simple policies. But a lot of times, you need sort of more dynamic policies than what I'm showing there. So for example, if in that example, we had a rule that restricted someone by their state. So we have, in this example, persons.state equals California. But if we want California to not be hard-coded, but be an actual value that's passed in from our application because we know something about that user, how can we do that? So we want to be able to pass in an ID that exists outside of the vault. Because a lot of times our applications have information about who the users are if we're using something like Auth0 or some sort of authentication model. Well, we want to be able to pass that data and have the vault essentially adhere or apply the rules based on who that entity is. So how can we do that? So this we support through something that we call context-aware authorization. And essentially, instead of having a hard-coded state, we can make that a variable value called context. And then when you're authenticating against the APIs, you can pass in that contextual value. So we can make state essentially dynamic. So if our system knows something about the person, then we can restrict essentially access to the data based on that knowledge. Another example would be we only want to give access to someone to the row of data that the person who's authenticated in our application actually has access to. Well, there we can essentially restrict by the person ID matching this contextual value that exists outside of the vault within our own application database. And the way that works, just from like a information flow, we could have a client-side front end essentially request a bearer token. Your back end is then going to grab the person ID from your application storage because you know who that is based on whatever your authentication system is. You can then attach that person ID as the contextual value when you're authenticating in Skyflow. We return the auth confirmation based on that contextual value and the other policies associated with that account. We return the bearer token, and now the only data that you can detokenize is essentially the data that exists in that row for that person ID. So even if someone somehow got that bearer token, got the tokens associated with the user, they only have access to that singular row of data rather than essentially all the data in the vault. One last example. So as a more complex example, a lot of times we might have a situation where the information you're trying to access is not necessarily the information that I own based on my model, but it's an association or a business relationship. So like a teacher needs to access their student records, or a doctor needs to access their patient records. So these types of relationship information we can also use in this contextual model. So we can have teacher A and teacher B. They essentially attach the context value of who they are, teacher A and teacher B. Now, what we want to do is retrieve the student records based on that restricted context. So if we have a vault with these students, each student is associated with a teacher, then essentially we can create a rule where the policy says that you only have access to the students where your teacher ID matches that contextual value. And what this means is essentially teacher A can access Bob Anderson and Henry Davis, and teacher B can access Julie Bird and Sally Smith. And then essentially they get those records. So it's going to be the exact same API call. Everything looks exactly the same. The only difference is that contextual value then controls exactly which records they have. So it's a very simple model to applying essentially data governance over your sensitive data. So last thing I'll cover here is just how Skyflow helps. So beyond essentially data governance, tokenization, we also can help with things like data localization. Every access to the vault is logged for auditing purposes. Because you're creating the singular source of truth of your sensitive data, things like complying with the right to be forgotten or the right to access one's information are much more simpler. And ultimately, it gives you a much more flexible, faster time to market because you're offloading compliance, data security, and data privacy to essentially a solution that's specifically designed for doing that. And that is going to save you time from essentially trying to build or maintain something like this yourself. And given all the privacy laws and how much the world is changing, we talked a little bit about this earlier, where essentially 75% of the world or 75% of people are going to be regulated under some type of law like this. You need a pretty flexible solution if you want to have essentially a global enterprise, and that's a lot to take on as your own company. So the big change that we're essentially saying is data privacy is about making essentially this architectural choice. We're saying that sensitive data doesn't belong essentially intermixed with all your regular application data. It belongs in a special location, which is this concept of the data privacy vault. And as long as you're making that architectural decision, a lot of these challenges around data privacy, compliance, data security, and even something like data residency becomes as simple as a handful of API calls. So that's a very quick introduction to Skyflow and some of the things that we're doing around data governance, tokenization, and so on. But I want to thank you very much. And I think we have some questions, so we can open it up there.
Sure. There are a couple of questions, Sean. One is from both questions are from Gaurav. So the first question is that implementation of Skyflow would require migration of large amounts of data and work with only SQL. What if an organization is using GraphQL and NoSQL, etc. approach in the backend?
Yeah, it's a great question. We actually have a number of customers that work migrate from NoSQL. That's not really an issue. And predominantly what you're doing when you're interacting with the vault, even though it's a schema-based vault, you're just making essentially API calls. So a lot of the like underlying pinnings of how it looks like might feel or look like a traditional SQL database, you can actually abstract a lot of that away. And we also support, we can technically support GraphQL APIs as well, but we're looking at essentially expanding that to be a more sort of native experience. But we do have customers using essentially all those different types of modes of operation. Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, I'm sorry, I was on mute. Yeah. Right. So, Gaurav, if your question is still not answered, just let us know in the chat section. Meanwhile, there's another question from Gaurav around, and wouldn't implementation would come in vendor lock-in for implementing organization and leave them with no way out?
So the vault is your vault. So you have complete access to the data at any point. It's not something that we have access to. We essentially manage the infrastructure of it, but we don't have access to the underlying data. So if you wanted to migrate off of it, there's nothing stopping you essentially from like pulling that data off of that. Now, if you're storing something like credit card information and you need to migrate off that gets a little more complicated, because if you're going to pull credit cards out of the vault, wherever you pull them, essentially if they're exposed in plain text values, then you would need to make sure that wherever you're putting that data, it's also in a PCI compliant infrastructure. So there is some complexity to it, but it doesn't mean that you can actually do that. So you can migrate through the system. And I would say that one of the big advantages of using something like a Skyflow data privacy vault when it comes to doing something like card acceptance, so you want to be able to take payments. Well, a lot of times if you're using a payment service like Stripe, then moving your credit card data, your customer credit card data in Stripe really does vendor lock you in. It's very hard to get your credit cards off of a system like Stripe. But if you want to essentially have flexibility to use multiple payment providers or migrate between them whenever you want, moving it into a system like Skyflow, where you actually own the data, now you can essentially federate those or proxy those calls to any payment provider that you want. That gives you a lot more actual business flexibility and control over the entire system.
Right. So I think there's a follow-up question on that as well.
Mm-hmm.
That tokenized data is another requirements of an organization. So does Skyflow does any partial or fully homomorphic encryption so that analytics can be performed on tokenized data?
Yes. So that's a great question. So there's a couple of things. So if you're storing tokenized data, say in your data warehouse, we support deterministic or consistent tokenization. So for a lot of analytical operations, you could still perform those natively within your data warehouse directly against the tokenized data, because it doesn't really matter for a lot of PII that it's necessarily the original values. So you don't need to store my name in your data warehouse versus a random string, as long as that random string gets consistently generated every time the input is my name. So you could still do counts and joins and things like that on that data. Now, for other specialized types of analytical queries, you could do those directly against the vault. And we pioneered a technology called polymorphic encryption, which actually allows you to perform operations over the fully encrypted data. So I could do something like, say I want to compute the average spend of my customers by country. Well, I could perform a query like that against the vault, compute that answer without actually unencrypting any of the underlying data.
Yeah, perfect. I think that answers the question, Gaurav. If you have anything over that, let us know. I think there's another question, probably the last one we'll take for this session, from Deepak around, can we bring our own keys to the vault so we have full control to data?
Yeah, so what I was mentioning earlier, where essentially we manage the infrastructure, but the data is yours, we will do out of the box, essentially encryption key management for you. So we'll rotate keys and all that sort of stuff. It doesn't mean that we have access to the data. Essentially, you're just applying the rules of the best in practice rules around encryption key management. But you can also bring your own encryption key. So if you are using something like HashiCorp Vault or there's lots of third-party encryption key managers. But if you have something like that, then essentially you can bring your own encryption key as an additional level of control over your data. And then you can manage the key rotation and so forth yourself.
The question is, the Indian data protection bill or the draft version is out there, and we might need to inform customers and obtain consent as well. So what do you think would be the implications of that?
Yeah, definitely. I think when this bill becomes an act, companies will need to comply with it, and definitely you need to be transparent in your practices. So the best practice would be to start today, not to wait for the Indian data protection bill to become an act. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add.
I think that's a very good point. Yeah.
I'll just add, if you look at what happened with like GDPR when it came in, like there was such a mad scramble around the world, to the point where a lot of businesses weren't ready and they basically just shut off access for people in Europe. You don't want to be, that's not like a good business practice. That you don't want to be caught that off guard. Don't wait essentially for these types of laws to come. Now is the time to be proactive.
Right. I think that also brings us to the end of the session. Thank you so much, Sean, and thank you, Bhaskar, for making it here. And if you would like to connect to Sean or have further questions on Skyflow, Mukul has put up his LinkedIn ID on the chat section, and you can connect with him on LinkedIn and probably bother him with questions on Skyflow, right? And Bhaskar, of course, is available for any data privacy related questions, and same as Tsaaro. So just a word of thanks from my end to you, Sean and Bhaskar. Thank you so much. I'll just hand it over to you if you want to thank the attendees and any further last thoughts that you would want to share.
Thank you, Krishna, for having us here. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks to everyone that listened in and for all the great questions. And yes, feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn. I love this is fun for me. I like to answer these types of questions. So
perfect. And thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend. Enjoy your weekend. Bye-bye.